Hey guys, this is your girl Jess Renae, bringing you some encouragement through the reading of the scripture. Today we're going to be reading from 1 Samuel 17. So we're going to kind of skip around in this book, so I will lay out the verses as we go. All right, so let's do a quick recap before we get started on chapter 16. All right, so basically, David was anointed to be king in front of his brothers and his father, but he did not actually operate in that position. Saul was still king over Israel, but he did not have the anointing of the Lord. So David was just humble and patient. He stayed as a sheep keeper until God elevated him to the next level. He was eventually elevated to play the harp for King Saul, and from there he found favor in the eyes of the king, and he requested that David stay with him as his armor bearer. All right, so now we are in chapter 17, and let's see what God has for us during this reading. Now, this is a longer book, so we're going to go ahead and just jump in and get started. Verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered in Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah, and Ephes-dammah. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered, and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountains on one side, and Israel stood on the mountains on the other side, with the valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. To go ahead and just further describe Goliath, we're going to jump down to verse 8. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not a servant of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servant and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Okay, we're going to jump down to verse 16. For 40 days, the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. 19. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took the provisions and went, as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the bags and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. Okay. All right, I know that was a lot of scriptures, but I wanted to read this whole passage so we can, get to where I believe God wanted us to get out of this portion. So as you see, David went back and forth, helping his father with his land and also coming back and being an assistance to Saul. So one of his trips of going to help his father with the land and the sheep, his father gave him some food and instructed him to bring it back to the men at war. He also wanted him to check on his brothers and make sure that they were good and bring back that word to him as well. So when David got back on the war zone site, he left all of the goods that his father had given him with the baggage keeper, and he ran and checked on his brothers. During this time while he was down there checking on his brother, Goliath came out and did his whole speech of calling somebody out to come and fight him. And if they can win against him, then they will be their servants, okay? And so at this point, this was David's first time hearing this. David was in the right place at the right time because he was following the instructions that were given to him. A lot of time we miss opportunities or we miss what God is trying to do because we're not being obedient. It seems insignificant. It seems small. Here David was an armor bearer of the king, knowing that he was anointed for the Lord. He was still following what may seem like the simple instructions that were given to him. And at that point, he was right where he needed to be. He heard the right thing that he needed to hear to provoke him to move forward with what God had planned for him. It does not matter how insignificant the plan may seem. If God is instructing you to do something, even if he's using somebody else, if God is instructing you to do something, just follow through because God will make sure that you're in the right place at the right time. All right, let's keep reading. All right, so we're going to go down to verse 24. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. And David said to the man who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way, so shall it be done to the man who kills him. And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the man. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumptions and the evil of your heart, for you have come to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him towards another and spoke in the same way. And the people answered him again as before. All right, so first I want to point out the fact that, do you see how offended David got when Goliath came up with his little speech that he had for Israel? He was offended because he knew who God was to him. He knew the power that God possessed. And so he knew that you are just a man. You can't come up against my living God. In this walk, there are going to be battles. There are going to be things that are going to come against you. And you have to be confident in who the Lord is to you and the power that you possess through him. Because those things are going to be there to take you out. But you cannot let that happen. You got to stand firm and remember who God is. David was doing what he was instructed to do, check on his brothers. He heard this. And of course, he stood up to who is this person? Now, even in doing right, there was nothing wrong that this man did. He took confidence in who God was. And, he portrayed that. But his own brother was offended. He was offended. And do you see how he tried to remind him of who he was? He said, and with whom have you left the sheep with? He just needed to remind you that you are just a sheep keeper. So you need to just chill out. It's interesting because that was his own family. That didn't stop David. David still stood his ground and said, I've done nothing. I've only asked a simple question. During this journey, everybody's not going to understand your walk. They're not going to understand the decisions you make. Everybody is not called for what you're called for. So they can't understand what you're going through, what you're doing. And sometimes they may presume it to be evil, selfish, crazy, whatever it may be. But you have to stand on what God has instructed you and who God has called you to be. You cannot get discouraged because even your family, are saying, are you sure you should be doing this? You got to stand firm in what God told you. You have to be confident, just like David was, and stand firm on where you're going and where God is calling you. Okay, let's keep going. Verse 31. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father, And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him with his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defiled the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hands of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Woo, that was good. Okay. Where do I even start here? So much to unpack. Okay, so once again, David's confidence and his character was brought back before the king. David did not have to do a special request to see the king or anything. Saul called him to come into his presence because he had been hearing this and he wanted to understand what this was all about. And so as David approached the king, you know, he approached him with that same confidence that he's always had in God. Saul is like, you can't do this. Again, he was trying to remind him of who he was. You know, you can't do what you're saying you're going to do because you're just a youth. And here this man has been fighting since he was a youth. You can't do this. There are going to be people in your camp, like we talked about, not just your family, but your support system, people that you thought was, you know, there for you, that will understand, that may not always understand what God is doing for you in that season. But you got to remain confident. You cannot sway because the people that's encamped around you are swaying. You have to stand firm in who God is. And how do you do that? You got to remember who God was to you and how he brought you through. David was doing what we considered a simple job, maybe one of the least of the jobs that's on a land. And here he is fighting bears and lions to upkeep what God had given him. And he knew that if God can save me from a lion's paw, can save me from this big, huge bear, that God can definitely help me to fight a man. He's just a man. So the whole time David was keeping his sheep, God was building something in him. He was building strength in him. He was building faith in him. He was building the confidence to know that if God can get me through that, he can get me through anything. He didn't worry about what everybody else was saying. He just remembered who God was to him, and he remained on the path that God had for him. As you go through this journey, you have to remember who God is to you, who God has shown himself to. God is going to take you through some things that you may not understand at that moment, but understand that he is still in control. So he is building character, he is building faith, and he is building strength to get you through the next battle and the battle that comes after that. Stand firm in the Lord and who he is to you guys. All right, next week we're going to be finishing up chapter 17. If you did not see the videos for 1 Samuel chapter 16, then make sure you click on this video and go and watch those. They were really good. All right, guys. Again, thank you so much for your support. I will see you in the next video.